I'm going to go ahead and get us kick started. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm so excited to have you join us today for YWCA Columbus's Racial Justice Challenge culminating webinar. We are rounding out the 2026 topic of democracy in progress, voting rights at 250. My name is Aaliyah Hiram. I am the program manager of empowerment programs here in our Leadership and Social Justice Department, and I'm one of two moderators for our day today. I'm joined with my colleague and dear friend Danielle, who is also going to be leading and directing our conversation. We're just so glad that you're here, whether you're coming to learn, to reflect, or to take that next step into action. We know that we cannot empower all without confronting systemic racism, and we act every day by raising awareness of the impacts of institutional and structural racism, and by building community among those who work for racial justice. So since 2015, YWCA USA have invited and inspired countless activists and advocates and allies to join us in the movement to eliminate racism through our annual Until Justice Just Is campaign. And this space is about honest conversation. Some topics may feel heavy, but they are necessary, and growth happens when we are willing to listen, to ask questions, and to stay engaged. So today, we're going to explore voting rights and barriers to access, highlighting tactics used to disenfranchise Ohioans, especially those experiencing housing insecurity, disability, and racial marginalization, and what we can do to counteract those efforts. I also want to acknowledge that the SAVE Act itself, while its current status may be stalled, the conversations that it raised around voter access and potential barriers are still very, very real. And so staying informed isn't just about what officially becomes law, it's about understanding the direction that we are moving and how it could shape present and future access. Now, I'm honored to be joined by three incredible panelists who bring both expertise and lived experience to these topics. Elizabeth Gracer, who is our Director of Training and Technical Institute at the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio, affectionately known as COHIO. Sophia Lombardo, who is our Operations Manager at League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus, and Alexia Kimmerling, who is the Director of Accessible Democracy at the American Association of People with Disabilities. So to get us started, I would like each panelist to just share a brief perspective of your focus area and a brief introduction to your org. Describe what they do and what intersects and how it connects voting rights and access. So we'll start with Elizabeth, if you don't mind.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really happy to be on the call. I think this might be like the third or fourth racial justice challenge that I've done with the YWCA, just in my either with a group or just, my own curiosity. So I really love this program that they put together and am so happy to be here. So like Aaliyah said, I am the Director of Training at the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio. We've been around since about 1984. We are a statewide organization. We work on advocacy and policy when it comes to ending homelessness in Ohio and across the nation. And we also advocate for additional affordable housing across the state. So in my role, do a lot of trainings for direct service providers that work in the area of housing and homelessness services in a lot of areas that the YWCA is probably really familiar with, and hopefully a lot of you on our call are as well, like motivational interviewing, trauma-informed care. We also do racial equity training as well. And just a little bit more about my background. Um, I have a legal background. I started off working in legal aid, doing housing and eviction work. And I have also spent a good number of years at the League of Women Voters as well, working in the democracy and voter rights space.
Amazing. We're so happy to have you. Thank you so much for taking this time. I'll go ahead and toss to Sophia.
Perfect. That was a good transition. Hi, my name is Sophia Lombardo. I'm the operations manager for the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus, took on after Elizabeth. I've only been in the role a year this month, but I have kind of a previous, thank you, a previous careers in the civic engagement and community engagement space. Fairly familiar with many of the nonprofits here in Columbus. And I'm also a proud graduate of the YWCA's Leadership for Social Justice cohort, class of 2023. Was a great experience and highly recommend it to anybody who is curious or wants to learn more about it. Um, so the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus, we've been around for 106 years, formed after the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote. And we continue to fight for that right and expand voting rights access to all and expand voter education to all. We really importantly, we're a nonpartisan organization, so we never tell anybody like who to vote for or what to vote, but just informing the public of their right to vote and the resources to learn more and um, guiding them to make the decisions that they want to make. We also do a ton of advocacy campaigns. So when there's an issue that we really connect with or support to increase voting rights, we will inform the public about, we'll educate those on how to talk to lawmakers, how to call your representative, any ways to kind of use your voice in the advocacy space as well. And then our organization is truly grassroots, run by our membership. I'm the sole staff member, so we take a lot of dedicated, passionate volunteers, which I'll definitely put a plug in later of how to volunteer with the league because we will use you as much as you would like. But that's who we are at the league. Been around for a long time and we are continuing to grow. So thank you for having me today.
Oh, I'm so obsessed and I adore you. Thank you so much for shouting out Leadership for Social Change.
Absolutely.
And shout out to you being a sole employee. That's incredible. Thank you for being here. And then finally, but certainly not least, Alexia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alexia Kemmerling. My pronouns are she, her. I'm so excited to be here and learn from my fellow panelists and share our experience with you. I am from the American Association of People with Disabilities, which is a national cross-disability organization that focuses on building political and economic power. While we are a national organization, our voting rights program is rooted in state and local change. And that is partially because, as you may know, the voting laws are different in every single state, but also rooted in our values belief that change comes from the ground up and it has to. So our voting program that I lead is called Rev Up, which I like to say is both an acronym and a call to action. And it stands for Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. And so we work to increase civic engagement in the disability community, but also to improve the accessibility of elections. It is not just on the people, the system needs to change so that our democracy can be inclusive. There are over 40 million eligible disabled voters in the United States, and we exist in every single community. And so our Rev Up program primarily works through, we have state disability vote coalitions that are made up of grassroots disabled activists and organizations working together to create change. So we have coalitions in 22 states and growing, and including Ohio. So we do everything from direct voter outreach, registration, providing support like accessible rides to the polls, to legislative advocacy, to training poll workers and auditing polling places, to legal advocacy. We have had coalitions serve as plaintiffs in federal voting rights lawsuits. So really coming at it from a lot of different avenues of change. Oh, and I should say too, I am a current member of the YWCA leadership program, which has been amazing so far.
We are beyond lucky to have you as well. So thank you so much, Alexia, for joining. I'm going to toss to my friend Danielle.
Hey there, everyone. I am Danielle Boyd. I am one half of the Justice, Equity, and Belonging team at YWCA Columbus, and I'm excited to be here having this conversation. I have shared space with our panelists in other contexts, so I know they have really great nuggets to share and really great perspectives that will help us kind of fuse some traditions of liberation and equity into the democratic process. And so. I'm going to go in the order of the folks and that you introduced yourself. So I'm going to start with you, Elizabeth, just to give you a heads up. But I want to share that we know that there are so many contributing factors in habits, traditions, and policies in lending that lead to disparate outcomes in the realm of housing. And we know that in Central Ohio, the population of folks experiencing homelessness is increasing. And though we are trying to address that issue, we don't necessarily know when there's some relief coming through. And so I'm curious to know what specific policies in Ohio might make it difficult for folks experiencing homelessness to vote. And then if there are some policies that are making it difficult, what might we be able to do to overcome some of those barriers?
Thanks, Danielle. Uh, I think you can come at this from two different angles. So, first, I'll just say from more of a cultural or societal aspect, like not talking about specific laws and rules, but just like how do we view voting? How do we view people that are homeless and extremely low income? I think a lot of people don't realize that you can vote if you're homeless. So I think a lot of people think that you need to have a permanent address in order to vote. And it is true that when you register to vote, you need to put an address down. You need to put an actual physical location down so that the Board of Elections knows where to assign you to vote, so that they know what you're going to be voting on. But in order to vote in the United States and in Ohio, all you have to be is 18 years of age or older, and you need to be a US citizen. So it doesn't say anything about any other of your circumstances, whatever those may be. So that is like one of the cultural aspects. Um, but there are additional policies and rules, some of them that have come into play fairly recently that make it harder for people that are extremely low income, housing insecure, and homeless to vote. So just to step back a bit and just go over like the three ways that we can vote here in Ohio for those of you that might not have worked in this space for years, like most of us on the panel have. You can vote in person on election day. You can vote um, early in person at the local Board of Elections, which is on Morse Road. So for the 4 weeks prior to election day, you can do that. And then you can also vote by mail. And there are barriers in all of those ways that affect people that are homeless. So you would think the most convenient way would be voting in person on election day because your polling location is going to be close by. You can walk, you don't have to worry about transportation. But in Ohio, a few years ago, and actually it might be more than a few years ago, time passes very quickly, but I would say, like within the last 4 years, we've had a change in Ohio law, and that when you go to vote in person, you have to show an Ohio ID. So, and it can't just be anything. It can't be like, a student ID or just anything with a picture on it. Like it has to be an official Ohio ID, either your driver's license or just your state ID, and it can't be expired either. So for individuals that are homeless or housing insecure, like that's a real barrier. A lot of them don't have an ID. Going to get an ID is can be complicated, can require you bringing your birth certificate or your social security card. Like there's just all kinds of complications when it comes to that. So that is a recent law in place here, which has made it much more difficult. And then to move back to the third option we have for voting, which is a mail-in ballot, you don't have to show like a photocopy or an actual um, copy of your ID. You just can put your the last four digits of your social. However, the process to do a mail-in ballot is a little antiquated, as you can probably tell by the fact that I use the word mail-in. There's multiple steps. You have to mail in a request form every election that you want to that you want to vote by mail. You have to have a place where you can receive the mail. So if you're homeless, most of the time the options are either a shelter where you're staying temporarily. It could be a community center that offers free meals or a church with a food pantry, a place that you have a relationship with, but you're not necessarily staying there. But then once you get your ballot, you can fill out, but then you have to mail it back in. Um, or you can take it up to Morse Road, which for some people may be convenient. For people that are down in like Grove City, not very convenient. So as you can see, like the process um, can get a little cumbersome. You need to have stamps. You need to just be able to navigate the system and think a few steps in advance. So that is, th those are barriers. And unfortunately, in Ohio, we've seen. I've been working in this area for probably about 15 years. We've seen more and more restrictive voting laws go on the record, and those are generally affecting low income individuals, people with disabilities, BIPOC communities, and sometimes older adults as well, much more than, just the general population. Want to say one other thing, switch back to the cultural aspect of barriers as well. I think that our other panelists would probably agree, and I'd love to hear what they have to say about this more, but we just need to change how we think about and talk about voting in this in this country. We have a really low voter turnout, except for the presidential election that happens every 4 years, but we have at least two elections every year. So we need to talk about voting as something that everybody does and make it more normalized, and just work to continue to make voting more inclusive. So I'll end there and turn it back to you, Danielle.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about how some of these barriers might be amplified based on other like social identities or intersectional identities that folks might experience. And so you mentioned that, we're seeing more restrictive policies coming out. I also believe that when we see more restrictions, we see more creativity. And so I'm curious to know if you've seen any creative methods to get folks engaged or to overcome some of those barriers that you might want to share with the larger community.
Yeah, that's a great question. My experience is that when you mess with people's rights, they get mad, right? So that is a positive thing because it motivates people to take action. In my job, we have been working with direct service providers to assist them in having that conversation with their clients about, hey, did you know you're eligible to vote? Let's check your voter registration as a part of just the whole process of helping a person who might be homeless, in the process of, finding housing and getting food benefits and just kind of making that part of the um, services that are providing. And I also know that my experience is mostly in Columbus and Franklin County, but organizations in Franklin County, nonprofit organizations, they are so willing to help. Like if someone needs a mailing address, if someone needs help filling out forms, like there are so many organizations that are happy to do that. So I don't think the fact that an individual doesn't have a permanent address and needs to find another place to accept mail, I don't think that in my experience, organizations have had any problems with helping people access those rights. So there's a lot of other things people have been doing, protests, um, um, public awareness campaigns, things like that. We work at Ohio, we work closely with the league. When it comes to just like getting out information. We have a huge stack of pamphlets that the league gave us that we've been handing out to people when it comes to like what's on your ballot this year. So I think we see a lot of like coordination, especially in area nonprofits, that's really positive and really just great to see all the cooperation.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. And I appreciate you taking that curveball question. I also want to share for folks who are viewing, feel free to use that Q&A or chat feature because Aaliyah's monitoring that. So I don't have to be the only one asking all of the great questions. But I thought that the idea of people when you are infringing on rights, people get mad and they take action. I feel like that is a perfect kickoff to Sophia. And I'm thinking about some of the things that we've seen recently with some of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act and seeing some of the things happening recently. And I know I have been a little bit mad and I want to take action. So I'm curious to know if you can tell me a little bit more about the landscape and how the League of Women Voters has been active in Ohio.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm mad too. So we could be mad together. So I first want to say for folks that may not be super familiar with like what are maps part like how are this part of the conversation and people aren't familiar with like the fight for fair districts. So having a fair maps in every state is how we connect voting power and representation. So individuals vote for who they want to vote for, but whether that person is able to win or has a chance of winning, or if that person actually represents your values, all of that is connected to the power behind your vote. And one way to get that power is to have maps that equally represent your voice. So in simplest forms, gerrymandering, which is a term I'm sure we've all heard, is when district lines are drawn to benefit politicians or political parties instead of voters. And so instead of the voters picking who they want, it's almost like people that are already in power picking who gets to vote for them, which just makes them stay in power longer. Um, so we see that this is unfair and we fight for it. Ohio has been fighting in this long fight for a long time. We saw some pretty positive reform in voting district lines in 2015 and 2018 because people across different political spectrums came together to want to recognize that the system and our current maps are not improved. But even with these reforms, we're still seeing a lot of issues with how these maps are drawn, and politicians are still being heavily influenced in how these maps are created. We all know politicians just want to remain in power as long as they can, so we don't totally trust them to make the most maps that are equitable to all. So currently in Ohio, our congressional maps very heavily favor Republicans at about a 12-3 advantage, despite Ohio being pretty active in this fight for voting for fair rights. Multiple Ohio maps were actually ruled unconstitutional by the Ohio Supreme Court, and there still hasn't been any real meaningful change in making them constitutional. So that's where I get mad is when our own government and we have these whole three branches of government that are supposed to have checks and balance and keep us accountable. But we're not kind of seeing that live out in the state of Ohio right now. You might have noticed in 2024, there was this big push through lots of organizations that the league was involved in to fight for fair maps. There was an issue on the ballot. It was issue one of the many issue ones that you may have seen the past couple of years in the state of Ohio. For this election, it was issue one, and it was to create a new commission to have a nonpartisan, like citizen-led group of individuals create these maps so we no longer have these political figures creating them for us and just retaining their own power. That did not pass, which was very frustrating for the league and for many of our partners that we work with. And there's many reasons why many people think the language of how the wording on the ballot was not very fair. It's really a confusing issue. It's kind of hard to explain. So there's many reasons why it didn't pass. So right now we are seeing maps that are still drawn by political figures. And then it was October 31st, 2025. There finally was a final like passing of our current map. So 2026, this year, the primary that we just had in May and the general election that we have in November, it's the first kind of voting year out of 3 years that we'll have our current maps. Um, so 3 years from now, we might see a difference. We've got to start working now and figuring out what these future maps will be. But for these next 3 years, here's the maps that we have, and here's how we're going to continue fighting this. So that's specifically in Ohio. Then looking at like greater nationally and what are all of our news feeds are probably having for the past week is how is the Voting Rights Act impacted by this work, and the callous decision that we just heard from in the state of Louisiana and the fight that they had. Um, the essential part of the Voting Rights Act gave individuals, non-white people, people of color, Black Americans specifically, the right to be able to register to vote without having to go through literacy tests or poll tax or any other barriers to vote. But the other part that was enacted in the 80s was called Section 2, and then there was Section 5 as well, that gave more power to the individuals to vote. So yes, you can vote, you can register to vote, but before these additional parts of the act were created, your vote, you likely were not going to win, your vote didn't have a lot of power, et cetera, et cetera. So these additional amendments or additions to the amendment were created to give more power to vote. It essentially made that in states, we can create maps and we can create districts that will equally represent the individuals that live in those districts. So a predominantly African American, predominantly people of color neighborhood have a power to be able to vote for individuals that they feel like represent their community, people that they want to vote for, people that they support, and communities nearby that are predominantly white or predominantly not of color cannot just decide everybody in the states or everybody in the general area as elected leaders. What this callous decision did was say, hey, we think that is unconstitutional. We don't believe in that. We want to be colorblind. We do not, and we know what that actually means. We know what the term colorblind actually means. And they want to say that race should not be a factor in creating districts at all. So that was just recently passed, or the Supreme Court recently made that decision, which essentially got rid of this whole Section 2 and parts of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act still exists. It's not just gone. We do not have literacy tests. We do not have many of the other barriers that it stopped for people of color to be able to vote and use their voice, or anybody to be able to use their voice. But these two, Section 2 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, that had a lot of like oomph behind them, are now obliterated, basically. So that means that district maps, state by state, can all look very different. There's not going to be representation of communities. That's why I'm mad too, is because people that fought for this right to vote and then have to continue to fight for that right to be powerful, that their right to vote, for them to win these elections, are just continually being knocked down. And these protections that this country worked so hard to make, like creating amendments and adding to amendments and changing the rules to make it more equitable, just keep getting erased. I love that graphic, and now I'm kind of rambling, but it's that graphic of individuals watching a baseball game, and it's the difference between equality, where there's the taller person is able to see over the fence and the shorter person is just staring at the fence. They are given no resources, versus equity, which is the term that we have to uplift those who may not have the resources. So the shorter person gets a little step stool so they can look over the fence. And what this removing of Section 2 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act did is remove any chance of equity in our Voting Rights Act. Yeah, I'll end there, but I hope that helps a little bit.
Oh, I definitely think that that is really good context. And for additional context, I think that a lot of people are mad because the headlines are overwhelming, and even the content of the news stories and articles are sometimes discouraging. And so, Sophia, I know that you have so much experience and knowledge and engagement. And so I'm curious to know for folks who are watching or people out in the community who are feeling a little overwhelmed or discouraged, they might not know where to start. How do they mobilize and get the word out? What advice would you give them? Or like, are there some successful methods you've seen?
Yeah, I think what Elizabeth shared earlier about how there's some really incredible organizations in Franklin County, Central Ohio, and across the state that are full of some very intelligent, very passionate people that can be mentors to anybody that wants to get involved, can hook you up with the resources, and can plug you in where you want to be in. Ohio Voting Rights Coalition, the League of Women Voters, like all of us are working and understanding kind of what's going on and then trying to explain it in a digestible way. I think it can be really overwhelming to read court documents of what happened on the Supreme Court and to see like how is this going to impact me in Ohio or me in Franklin County, and leave that to the those of us that enjoy reading those things and digesting those things, and seeing where you can plug in for how we can, call our representatives, write letters to the community, create social media posts on how to spread the word about this. So to answer your question, like there's so many organizations, there's so many people that are just waiting and desperately wanting somebody to send an email or a phone call and say, "Hi, I'm passionate about this issue. How can I help?" I'll say for the League of Women Voters Metro Columbus, anytime I get an email or a phone call or a text saying, "Hey, I have a couple hours of my time a week. How can I help your organization?" Or "I'm really passionate about stopping gerrymandering. How can I get involved?" And I'm like, "Let's get coffee. Let's talk. Like, let me see where I can support you." And I'm sure any of us here would say the same thing for anybody that would reach out. Um, I think just taking the pressure down of like, you don't have to be some expert. You don't have to have a law degree, even though it is really helpful if you do. You don't have to like have an incredible like long resume of skills. Like we'll find a place to put you in to help.
See, everyone, this is what I'm talking about. So many good nuggets. Okay, so I've been able to ask some questions, but I haven't taken a peek at the chat. Aaliyah, do we have any questions in the chat from any of the folks viewing the webinar so far?
Now reporting live from the chat feature. We have a lovely question from Amy. Amy asks, what can we do about the restrictions at the primaries, only allowing us to vote either Democrat or Republican, not independents allowed? I was a poll worker, Amy was a poll worker, on May 5th, and this caused many questions about, are my voting rights being suppressed? It is her understanding that this has always been the case for primaries, but can we change that? If anyone would like to jump in.
I don't have an answer, but I'll provide a little bit of context for folks that may not be independents, that may not totally understand the question. So, in the state of Ohio, we have what's called a closed open primary state. And it's both closed and open because when you go to vote on a primary, whether that's in person on election day or early, or when you're filling out your request for an absentee ballot, you do need to declare a party. You need to ask for the specific ballot that you want. In the state of Ohio, Democrats for primaries, if you say you're a Democrat, you only get Democrat candidates. If you say you're a Republican, you only get Republican candidates. We do also have a Libertarian ballot. So if you say you're a Libertarian, you'll get Libertarian ballots. If you say that you are an independent, the Board of Elections will give you what's called an issues only ballot. Because for primary elections at this time, we don't have, the state of Ohio doesn't recognize, I guess is the word, it might not be the right term, independent candidates. So you would only be voting on issues, measures, tax levies, any of the other like items that you spend a long time reading and vote yes or no on. But you wouldn't be voting on specific candidates. It's very different in other states. Some states you can pick and choose throughout parties, but in the state of Ohio, that's how it currently is. And the reason why that's why we're a closed state. Why we're an open state is because it can change year to year. So one year you can pull a Republican ballot, the next year you can pull a Democrat ballot. You're not tied to that party forever. And then in the general election, of course, you have the same ballot as everybody. I think Elizabeth might have another tidbit to share there.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I was going to share. I don't really see our primary structure here in Ohio changing. It's been this way for a long time. And we are a bit more open than a lot of states because uh, let's say I consider myself a libertarian, but maybe 2 weeks ago at the election, I was like, I'm going to vote Republican because I want to make sure I vote for this particular candidate to win. So there's no restriction on you as a voter. You don't have to have registered or affiliated yourself with a particular political party outside of the election in order to request the ballot. And I think that's where a lot of people get confused. They think, oh, because I have voted Republican for the last 20 years, I can't select a Democrat ballot. But um, there's no rule for or against that. And yeah, so it's kind of the primaries, there's a lot of different ways you can organize them. It is a little bit restrictive because you can't vote for everybody. That's kind of the point of the primary. You are locked into a particular ballot. And really quick, just one other point, like piggybacking off of what Sophia was saying about gerrymandering, the more gerrymandered a state is, the more important the primaries are. Because if you already know that in your state, a Republican is going to win for this particular congressional seat, well, the general election all of a sudden isn't as important because you know the Democrat's not going to win. So if you're really interested in having a say in who the person is that's going to be representing you and you know the political party that's going to win, well, you want to get out there and vote in the primary so that your vote is, um, I would say, has the most impact.
Just
Thanks for that.
Alexia.
I was going to
Oh,
say,
sorry.
Alexia, did you want to get in on this question before I ask mine?
Yes, I'll just say super quickly. Do I think it's likely that Ohio will change how its primaries are run? No, but I think it is possible. There are states that have changed how their primaries have run, and there actually has been a trend, like in the last 3 years, where a lot of states with closed primaries have introduced bills to change how their primaries are run. And this is something that there is bipartisan support for because many people do not strongly identify with one party or the other. So um, Arizona, Idaho, Pennsylvania have all introduced legislation to explore changing their primaries. So I think it is possible through state legislative processes, just maybe not likely at this moment in time, but does not mean that we cannot try.
Oh, I appreciate that. And thanks for hopping in there on that question. And I'm going to encourage our viewers to continue to pop those questions in there. But Alexia, I want to share that I really value coalition work. And I feel like one of the most valuable parts of coalition work is learning about people's lived experiences, right? And so I recognize that working in a space advocating for folks living with disabilities, there might be some like misconceptions or assumptions. And so I'm curious to know, like, what are some common misconceptions or assumptions about folks voting with disabilities, or maybe even some information about how folks experiencing life with disabilities might have been disenfranchised currently or even historically?
Miss Alexia, thank you so much for that question. I think unfortunately one of the biggest misconceptions is that disabled people can't vote and that disabled people don't vote. So in my work, I really prioritize reaching voters who are not going to be reached by traditional canvassing methods like door knocking, text banking, mailers. So thinking about people that live in nursing homes, in state operated developmental centers, state psychiatric hospitals, even jails. We count jails within the disability community because not only are disabled people overrepresented in our prison system, but our prison system also disables people from trauma and just the violence of going through the system, right? And so in those experiences, registering voters in those spaces, I regularly meet disabled adults who are in their 50s, in their 60s, who have never voted, who have been told by their family members, by caregivers, by people in positions of power over them that they can't vote, or just don't worry about voting. It's too complicated for you. Don't worry about it. It doesn't matter to you. And that is not true. Anyone who has a desire to vote should be able to access the ballot, but that is not a reality in our country. And I think many people are also unaware of the accommodations available to them to vote. So I also do a lot of demonstrations of accessible voting machines, and I have met blind voters who have been voting for their whole life, but who have never used the accessible voting machine and are moved to tears, realizing that they can vote independently with an audio ballot, but also still really valuing the importance of voter assistance. To me, independence does not mean doing it yourself. It means controlling how it is done. So just because you need someone to assist you to vote does not mean that you are not an independent person making your own choice, right? And to think about the second part of your question, sort of the history of disenfranchisement. So something I've really been reflecting on a lot in the Racial Justice Challenge is just how recent and ongoing the civil rights movement is. And the same is true for the disability rights movement. So up until the mid 1970s, Columbus had what was called an ugly law. So it was illegal for people with physical disabilities, mental illnesses to be in public. And this disproportionately affected unhoused folks. And so if you are not even allowed to exist in a public space, how are you going to participate in the community, right? The Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, which is so recent. And it wasn't until 1984 that there was any legislation that gave rights specifically to disabled people. And even though, by 1990, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, among other things, required all polling places to be accessible, we are still not seeing that regularly be a reality. So one of our coalitions in Michigan and did an audit of 265 polling places in Detroit, and only 13% of them were fully accessible. So if you cannot even get into your polling place, and that's also a problem because polling places are often community centers, right? Schools, churches, warming centers. And so if you're thinking about not only can you access it on election day, but also in your daily life, that is a really exclusive and oppressive thing to experience. And sorry, I guess I'm getting like worked up, but I also just want to name too that ableism is rooted in racism, and all voter suppression tactics are rooted in racism, right? Like the way that our society assigns values to people's bodies and minds is rooted in anti-Blackness. And so thinking too in the Racial Justice Challenge, there was the example of the literacy tests, right? And we tend to think that literacy tests are no longer in our country. And for disabled people, that is not necessarily true. So if you have a guardian in 7 states, you automatically lose your right to vote. In many other states, you have to prove that you have the competency to vote in court. You have to answer questions about how the system works. And that only applies to people with intellectual disabilities. Luckily, that is not true in Ohio. However, because it is true in other states, there's a lot of misinformation. And so many people who do have guardians in Ohio or who do have intellectual disabilities think that they don't have the right to vote, or think that they have to go through a court system to get that right. And even though that's not true in our policy, it still prevents them from voting. So there are just so many ways where those historical disenfranchisement policies are still in action today.
Yeah, I love that definition about independence. I feel like I haven't heard that perspective before, and so I can't wait to use that in some of our external, well, and even internal workshops. Um, but I'm gonna ask a little bit about curiosities and creativity. But I do want to know what actions can be taken now to support communities of folks living or experiencing disabilities, or maybe even like some opportunities for like positive social change or even just like incremental positive change.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And one reason I'm so grateful for this conversation is because I think strong cross movement solidarity and action is deeply important. So um, thinking about there's been a lot of trends across states to criminalize or limit voter assistance, which of course directly impacts disabled voters, but it also deeply impacts communities of color because many support workers and nursing home staff are disproportionately Black women, right? So if you're criminalizing them participating in the voter assistance, that is a really good example of like a cross movement issue. So really wanting to encourage um, folks who are organizing in other specific communities or more broadly to make sure that your materials are fully accessible, that you are explicitly mentioning disability in your talking points. Naming barriers and naming who they affect is really, really important, and then being able to address them. And then also just on even the smaller level, yeah, shout out to Amy for being a poll worker. Thank you so much for your service. I would encourage everyone on the call to be a poll worker. And then before you do, beef up your knowledge on accessibility. Um, and you can really make a difference in one person's voting experience that can be extremely powerful for their life.
Oh, thank you for that. I'm gonna kick it over to Aaliyah to see if we might have any additional questions in the chat. And then if you want to talk about next steps or where we can go from here, how we can continue to be encouraged, I'd appreciate leaving on a positive note.
Yes, of course. Real quick, I do have a question from Meghana. She asks about assisted voting. If someone is blind or utilizing assisted voting, how can they be certain that their voting preferences are being honored and that the person providing assistance isn't voting differently from what they desire?
Dyslexia, yeah, it's a really great question, Meghana. So, um, a couple things. Number one, if someone goes in person, they can listen to the audio ballot and verify themselves that their decisions are what they selected. However, there are a couple of different types of accessible voting machines, and one type of accessible voting machine then prints out your ballot, and then you have to carry that ballot over to the tabulator, and that is not a fully accessible experience and something that we really advocate to change because if you have to deal with a physical piece of paper, that is not going to be accessible for many disability types. If you are using voter assistance to mark your ballot, if you are using it at the polling place, they should provide one Democrat and one Republican poll worker. You do have a right to choose a person of your choice as long as it's not your union representative, your boss, or a candidate on the ballot. And so often people will choose someone in their life that they feel very comfortable with and have a high level of trust with. But it's a great question and one reason that we are advocating for other methods of accessible voting machines and electronic ballot return, which would make voting by mail fully accessible.
Thank you so much, Alexia, and thank you for asking that, Meghana. As we transition a little bit, we're going to talk a little bit about voter apathy, which we've sort of touched on here and there. And Campus Vote Project and the HBCU Legacy Initiative mentions that what is often labeled as voter apathy is better understood as a response to structural barriers and lack of institutional support rather than a lack of political interest or engagement. And I actually had a question in the chat as well. So, Munir, I feel like you actually looked at my notes here. But you asked here, Ohio data often shows lower turnout and higher provisional ballot rate in non-white communities. How do we shift the conversation with our people from individual voter responsibility to addressing the structural conditions that produce these disparities? Because they mentioned that they feel as though a lot of voter engagement is focused on individual responsibility rather than addressing the systems that cause voter fatigue and lower turnout. And I know that each of the questions I want to ask you all kind of touches on that. So if one of you just want to start with addressing this voter apathy that is created and the structural barriers that are also intertwined in that.
I can go. I don't know who wants to go first. I love Campus Vote Project, so I'm so glad that they were kind of infused into this conversation. I think a really trigger response that people have when we talk about voter apathy or we see low voter turnout numbers or whatever it is to say, oh, people in that community just don't care. And that is like the biggest red flag. People do care. People care about their safety. They care about their neighbors. They care about their health, whatever the issue is, housing, all of this is. What's missing is trust that the system will work or that, what you vote on will actually happen. Trust in our politicians that what they say is what they're going to vote on or what they're going to enact. Trust that their vote will actually make an impact. And because there's not a lot of trust in these systems, because we've seen it not go our way, and I won't say we've seen it fail because I don't necessarily think that it's failed, but it feels that sense of failure. You feel that sense of, um, a person that I vote for never wins, so it must have failed. And I get that feeling, but there's just that mistrust. And then people feel ignored when they share that. People feel that when they raise their concerns about accessibility or they raise their concerns that the person that they voted for didn't actually do what they say they were going to do or the system isn't working, there's a sense of not feeling heard in that space. So it's not that people don't care, it's that the system has created a lot of barriers and a lot of disengagement and people wanting to continue to show up, voting 2 to 3 times a year, as we know, a primary, general, and sometimes a special election. So when we see lower voter turnout in certain communities, or we see higher provisional ballots or whatever, we need to ask the deeper question of are people working multiple jobs, waiting in long lines? Is there a lack of transportation? Is there accessibility concerns? Are the cost of IDs too expensive so people don't have IDs to show? What are the reasons that our system is creating that partnered with this lack of trust and this feeling of being ignored when concerns are raised are pulling people are opting out to participate. The other thing I want to mention is I think something that we saw in 2023, 24, a little bit in 22 as well, is that people are making the conscious decision to not participate in voting in certain elections. Like maybe they're voting in local elections, but they're deciding to skip on a presidential campaign because they don't feel like either candidate really represents them. And that is a different conversation. And I think people that are consciously making that decision because it's, their core belief or their foundational thing that they care about is not being represented on either side. That is not voter apathy. Those are people participating in civic engagement in a different way. And those people should not be shamed for that decision that they make, which is a whole other conversation we can get into another time. But people like to lump those people into one group of, oh, they just don't care or they're just not participating. Well, they do care. They are just choosing what systems they want to participate in. So I'll end it there. I don't know if Elizabeth or Alexia want to add anything else to that.
I'll just say really quick that a lot of conversations that I have with people that don't vote isn't because they don't care. Like Sophia gave an excellent answer to that, but they also don't know how to find information about what's on the ballot. So if you go to vote in November, there's going to be all kinds of races on there, like a bunch of judges. You've never heard of them before. The thought of having to, find out where to get good, reliable information, like that can be challenging. I have some suggestions, and that would be the League of Women Voters at Vote 411. But, just that idea of like, oh, I'm not just taking 15 minutes out of my day to go to the polling location, but I also need to have like all this information in my head of like where people stand on everything and all of that information. So I think having more information in our society about like where can you go to find good information? Like who do you trust? How can you get that? And then another thing that has been discussed in various circles is like, why don't we make Election Day a holiday? So in other countries, when there is a big election, it's like you don't work that day, so you have time to go and vote. But that is not how we treat it in our country. So that's just like one example of creative thinking that you can look to other countries who have done both carrot and sticks when it comes to voting, some really interesting ones about how we could make structurally voting more accessible for everyone.
This Alexia, and this is not getting at the systems part of Monier's question, but I just wanted to like dig into the piece of like individual responsibility. I think I'm also really interested in seeing us shift our language to emphasize our collective power. Like, yes, our vote is us individually making a choice, but it's really together that we have a lot of power. And it's not, you don't have to do it alone, right? Like I have hosted like ballot reading parties with my friends to like Google all the candidates together. So we don't all have to do the research ourselves, right? Or making it like really fun and exciting. It's important to name the barriers, but it can also be like fun and exciting. So every time I do voter registration events, like it is, we do fun things too. Like I've hosted a democracy salon where I bring in cosmetologists to give out manicures while we talk about making our plan to vote. Or I have a ballot bingo. Like voting, it is a responsibility. It is hard. It's important to name all of those things, but that doesn't mean it can't also be fun and be like a community collective experience.
I just wanted to hop in really quickly, Alexia. I feel like you have been coming in with all of the heavy hitting facts, but you talked a little bit about collective power, and it really reminds me of our restorative practices workshop that we offer, really thinking about the fact that we cannot do this alone. And so, what does it look like to be in community with one another, to care about our neighbors and care about ourselves, and figure out ways that we can work together to infuse some systems of liberation against all of these sucky systems of oppression. And so that is definitely something that a connection that I made to the work. And I just want to thank you all for really being committed to working in coalition and working in community with one another, because that is where we will find the most progress and liberation.
Absolutely. I want to echo that. I appreciate hearing the humanity and the work that each one of you do. I think it's so important to see each other as wholes and be able to acknowledge and emphasize that. And with that, I do want to do a quick round robin. We're going to go around to each person. I want you to tell me in just a few words, what brings you hope right now? What is your energy? Where's your core? What's bringing you hope? We can start with Alexia. I'm so sorry. I'll reverse this order this time.
Reverse. Well, I mentioned at the top of the call that I'm very lucky to get to work with coalitions in 22 states. And so it reminds me every single day that there are people in every single community who care deeply and who are doing really good work to make change. And also getting to have sort of a national scope. I think we highlight the negative a lot, which is really fair. And I don't want to minimize the impact of the restrictive bills we've seen. But last year, there were actually 51 bills passed across states that improved election access compared to 37 that restricted. And then lastly, really quick, the great thing about democracy and voting is that it's not a mystery what works and what is the good policies. Like we literally know the answers to the problem, and we also know how to implement the answer to the problem. And that's a really good spot to be in. So like it is very possible to get to an inclusive, accessible democracy.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Sophia, go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, that was really great. A lot of the thoughts that I had were about like building community too. So I really appreciate you sharing that, Alexia. I think another thing to mention is that there is no like right way to do civic engagement. Voting is not like the only way to participate. There's, you know, volunteering, educating your neighbors, attending community meetings like school board meetings or neighborhood association meetings, advocating for accessibility or advocating for different groups that you see are not getting well resourced. Just talking to your neighbor and seeing what issues have in their yard. Like, I'm cutting my grass. I see that your grass needs cut. Maybe I'll go over there and cut yours. Like that kind of community support are all ways that you can get involved in a civic engagement space. So that gives me hope is like seeing more people participate. There's this whole like, I don't want to call it a trend because it makes it sound unserious, but there's this like community thing going on right now called neighborism. And people are coming back to connecting with their neighbors and connecting with their community face to face and within like where you live and where you spend most of your time. So that gives me hope and just seeing other ways to show up because showing up is hard, but it can be the first step to getting involved deeper. So, yeah.
Thank you. Elizabeth, go ahead, Rhonda.
Well, I will share a more like individual story. It's graduation season. So I was talking to a neighbor who's graduating from high school. Um, I'm in Franklin County and she's going to be at University of Cincinnati next year. And she was telling me how she already like has plans of how she's gonna, get registered down at school. She was talking to her friends to make sure that they all knew how to like, make sure that they're registered at their campus because there can be a few like differences when you're voting in college. And I was just like so pleased and yeah, it just gave me hope that like, these younger generation, people just turned 18, they're thinking about it and they're talking to their friends. So that maybe is just like one individual story, but I'm hoping that creates ripple effects. So, yeah.
Absolutely amazing. Danielle, any final words that bring you hope?
I'm hopeful that people are still choosing to be engaged and still choosing joy.
Same. I was gonna say that. I love that so much. I just want to say thank you so much. We are at that 1 o'clock hour. You all bring me hope. The way that we all are coming together is bringing me hope. And the people who joined today, thank you so much because you're a piece of us being able to have hope in this change and seeing the good. And so thank you so much to our panelists for your honesty, for your insight. Thank you for everyone who took the time and brought your lunch to the screen this afternoon to join us. The conversation doesn't have to end here. So if you come up with a question later, shoot me an email. I'm happy to reach out to our panelists and be able to get an answer for you. Awareness is just the beginning. It's what we do next that really does truly matter. So if there's any resources, please know there are sources in this year's challenge to support your knowledge and building of knowledge and understanding. So you can still sign up. The resources for the challenge are available again for a year after the close. Get involved. And to quote YWCA USA, may what you've learned over the 21 days of our challenge strengthen your commitment to that vision. And may we continue to work together until justice truly just is. So never forget that together we rise, get together, link up. Thank you so much for today and have an incredible day.